This is the Chambers Street Theater, and I'm Ruth Chambers, and we read a lot of various literature from the Gold Rush and that time period. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. This book that we're reading today is 2 years before the Mast, and that was approximately 1834. So we're talking a little over 10 years before the Gold Rush. One of the effects of the Gold Rush was for people to believe that they could become rich and change their station in life. Prior to the Gold Rush, if you were not rich, if you were a poor person, you had to do the best you could and take whatever job you could get. And the pay was not good. Very often you worked for room and board. You were lucky to be fed, not well, but fed, and sleep in some kind of a barn or shack. Sometimes you would even get some money. It was a very hard life. And that's what we're reading about in 2 years before the Mast. The kind of life where there was no hope. The Gold Rush brought hope. Anyone could become a great gentleman, could become a millionaire. And that whole change of attitude is because of the Gold Rush. So today we're going to read from a book that wasn't designed to be read out loud, and I'm giving it my best effort. I have rehearsed a great deal for this. It's one tongue twister after another, but we're going to give it a try. Here goes. The first two chapters of 2 years before the Mast by Richard Henry Dana Jr. The 14th of August was the day fixed upon for the sailing of the brig Pilgrim on her voyage from Boston round Cape Horn to the western coast of North America. As she was to get under way early in the afternoon, I made my appearance on board at 12 o'clock. In full sea rig, with my trunk containing an outfit for a 2 or 3 years voyage, which I had undertaken from a determination to cure, if possible, by an entire change of life and by a long absence from books, with plenty of hard work, plain food, and open air, a weakness of the eyes, which had obliged me to give up my studies, and which no medical aid seemed likely to remedy. The change from the tight frock coat, silk cap, and kid gloves of an undergraduate at Harvard to the loose duck trousers, checked shirt, and hat of a sailor, though somewhat of a transformation, was soon made. And I supposed that I should pass very well for a Jack Tar, but it is impossible to deceive the practiced eye in these matters. And while I thought myself to be looking as salt as Neptune himself, I was no doubt known for a landsman by everyone on board as soon as I hove in sight. A sailor has a peculiar cut to his clothes and a way of wearing them which a green hand can never get. Doubtless my complexion and hands were quite enough to distinguish me from a regular salt, who with a sunburned cheek, wide step, and rolling gait swings his bronzed and toughened hands half open and just ready to grasp a rope. With all my imperfections on my head, I joined the crew, and we hauled out into the stream and came to anchor for the night. The next day we were employed in preparation for sea, reeving studding sail gear, crossing royal yards, putting on chafing gear, and taking on board our powder. On the following night, I stood my first watch. I remained awake nearly all the first part of the night from fear that I might not hear when I was called. And when I went on deck, so great were my ideas of the importance of my trust that I walked regularly fore and aft the whole length of the vessel, looking out over the bows and taffrail at each turn, and was not a little surprised at the coolness of the old seaman who I called to take my place in stowing himself snugly away under the longboat for a nap. That was a sufficient outlook, he thought, for a first night at anchor in a safe harbor. The next morning was Saturday, and a breeze having sprung up from the southward, we took a pilot on board, hove up our anchor, and began beating down the bay. I took leave of those of my friends who came to see me off, and had barely opportunity for a last look at the city and the well-known objects, as no time is allowed on board ship for sentiment. As we drew down into the lower harbor, we found the wind ahead in the bay and were obliged to come to anchor in the roads. We remained there through the day and part of the night. My watch began at 11 o'clock at night, and I received orders to call the captain if the wind came out from the westward. About midnight, the wind became fair, and having summoned the captain, I was ordered to call all hands. How I accomplished this, I do not know, but I am quite sure I did not give the true hoarse call of "All hands up anchor! Ahoy!" In a short time, everyone was in motion, the sails loosed, the yards braced, and we began to heave up the anchor, which was our last hold upon Yankee land. I could take but small part in these preparations. My little knowledge of a vessel was all at fault. Unintelligible orders were rapidly given and so immediately executed. There was such a hurrying about and such an intermingling of strange cries and stranger actions that I was completely bewildered. There's not so helpless and pitiable an object in the world as a landsman beginning a sailor's life. At length, those peculiar, long-drawn sounds which denote that the crew are heaving at the windlass began, and in a few minutes we were under way. The noise of the water thrown from the bows was heard. The vessel leaned over from the damp night breeze and rolled with the heavy groundswell, and we had actually begun our long, long journey. This was literally bidding good night to my native land. The first day we passed at sea was Sunday. As we were just from port, there was a great deal to be done on board, and we were kept at work all day. And at night the watches were set and everything was put to sea order. When we were called aft to be divided into watches, I had a good specimen of the manner of a sea captain. After the division had been made, he gave a short, characteristic speech, walking the quarterdeck with a cigar in his mouth and dropping the words out between the puffs. "Now, my men, we have begun a long voyage. If we get along well together, we shall have a comfortable time. If we don't, we shall have hell afloat. All you have got to do is obey your orders and do your duty like men. then you will fare well enough, and if you don't, you will fare hard enough. I can tell you. If we put together, you will find me a clever fellow. If we don't, you will find me a bloody rascal. That's all I've got to say. Now go below. The larboard watch. I, being in the starboard or second mate's watch, had the opportunity of keeping the first watch at sea. Simpson, a young man making, like myself, his first voyage, was in the same watch, and as he was the son of a professional man and had been in a merchant's counting room in Boston, we found that we had some acquaintances and topics in common. We talked these matters over, Boston, what our friends were probably doing, our voyage, etc., until he went to take his turn at the lookout and left me to myself. I had now a good opportunity for reflection. I felt for the first time the perfect silence of the sea. The officer was walking the quarterdeck where I had no right to go. 1 or 2 men were talking on the forecastle, whom I had little inclination to join, so that I was left open to the full impression of everything about me. However much I was affected by the beauty of the sea, the bright stars and the clouds driven swiftly over them, I could not but remember that I was separating myself from all social and intellectual enjoyments of life. Yet, strange as it may seem, I did then and afterward take pleasure in these reflections, hoping by them to prevent my becoming insensible to the value of what I was losing. But all my dreams were soon put to flight by an order from an officer to trim the yards, as the wind was getting ahead, and I could plainly see by the looks the sailors occasionally cast to windward, and by the dark clouds that were fast coming up, that we had bad weather to prepare for, and I had heard the captain say that he expected to be in the Gulf Stream by 12 o'clock. In a few minutes, 8 bells were struck. The watch called, and we went below. I now began to feel the first discomforts of a sailor's life. The steerage, in which I lived, was filled with coils of rigging, spare sails, old junk, and ship stores, which had not been stored away. Moreover, there had been no berths put up for us to sleep in, and we were not allowed to drive nails to hang our clothes upon. The sea, too, had risen. The vessel was rolling heavily, and everything was pitched about in grand confusion. There was a complete hurrah's nest, as the sailors say, everything on top and nothing at hand. A large hawser had been coiled away on my trunk. My hats, boots, mattress, and blankets had all fetched away and gone over to leeward, and were jammed and broken under the boxes and coils of rigging. To crown all, we were allowed no light to find anything with, and I was just beginning to feel strong symptoms of seasickness, and the listlessness and inactivity which accompanying it. Giving up all attempts to collect my things together, I lay down on the sails, expecting every moment to hear the cry, "All hands ahoy!" which the approaching storm would make necessary. I shortly heard the raindrops falling on deck thick and fast, and the watch eventually had their hands full of work, for I could hear the loud and repeated orders of the mate, trampling of feet, creaking of the blocks, and all the accompaniments of a coming storm. In a few minutes, the slide of the hatch was thrown back, which let down the noise and tumult of the deck still louder. The cry of, "All hands ahoy! Tumble up here and take in sail!" saluted our ears, and the hatch was quickly shut again. When I got upon deck, a new scene and a new experience was before me. The little brig was close hauled about the wind and lying over, as it then seemed to me, nearly upon her beam ends. The heavy head sea was beating against her bows with the noise and force almost of a sledgehammer, and the flying over the deck drenching us completely through. The topsail halyards had been let go, and the great sails were filling out and backing against the masts with a noise like thunder. The wind was whistling through the rigging. Loose ropes were flying about, loud, and to me, unintelligible orders constantly given and rapidly executed, and the sailors singing out at the ropes in their hoarse and peculiar strange. In addition to all this, I had not got my sea legs on, was dreadfully seasick, with hardly strength enough to hold on anything. And it was pitch dark. This was my condition when I was ordered aloft for the first time to reef topsails. How I got along, I cannot now remember. I laid out on the yards and held on with all my strength. I could not have been of much service, for I remember having been sick several times before I left the topsail yard, making wild vomits into the black night to leeward. Soon all was snug aloft, and we were again allowed to go below. This I did not consider much of a favor, for the confusion of everything below, and that inexpressible, sickening smell caused by the shaking up of bilge water in the hold, made the steerage but an indifferent refuge from the cold, wet decks. I had often read of the nautical experiences of others, but I felt as though there could be none worse than mine. For in addition to every other evil, I could not but remember that this was only the first night of a 2 years' voyage. When we were on deck, we were not much better off, for we were continually ordered about by the officer, who said that it was good for us to be in motion, yet anything was better than the horrible state of things below. I remember very well going to the hatchway and putting my head out when I was oppressed by nausea, and always being relieved immediately. The state of things continued for 2 days. Wednesday, August 20th. We had the watch on deck from 4 till 8 this morning. When we came on deck at 4 o'clock, we found things much changed for the better. The sea and wind had gone down and the stars were out bright, and I experienced a corresponding change in my feelings, yet continued extremely weak from my sickness. I stood in the waist on the weather side, watching the gradual breaking of the day and the first streaks of the early light. There is something in the first gray streaks along the eastern horizon and throwing an indistinct light upon the face of the deep, which combines with the boundlessness and the unknown depth of the sea around, and gives one a feeling of loneliness, of dread, and of melancholy foreboding, which nothing else in nature can. This gradually passes away as the light grows brighter, and when the sun comes up, The ordinary, monotonous sea day begins. From such reflections as these, I was aroused by the order from the officer, "Forward there! Rig the head pump!" I found that no time was allowed for daydreaming, but that we must turn to at the first light. Having called up the idlers, namely carpenter, cook, and steward, and rigging the pump, we began washing down the decks. This operation, which is performed every morning at sea, takes nearly 2 hours, and I had hardly strength enough to get through it. After we had finished swabbing down decks and coiled up the rigging, I sat on the spars waiting for 7 bells, which was the signal for breakfast. The officer, seeing my lazy position, ordered me to slush the mainmast from the royal masthead down. The vessel was then rolling a little, and I had taken no food for 3 days, so that I felt tempted to tell him that I had rather wait until after breakfast. But I knew that I must take the bull by the horns, and that if I showed any sign of want of spirit or backwardness, I should be ruined at once. So I took my bucket of grease and climbed up to the royal masthead. Here the rocking of the vessel, which increases the higher you go from the foot of the mast, which is the fulcrum of the lever, and the smell of the grease, which offended my fastidious senses, upset my stomach again, and I was not a little rejoiced when I had finished my job and got about the comparative terra firma of the deck. In a few minutes 7 bells were struck, the log hove, the watch called, and we went to breakfast. I cannot describe the change which half a pound of cold salt beef and a biscuit or two produced in me. I was a new being, having a watch below until noon, so that I had some time to myself. I got a huge piece of strong cold salt beef from the cook, and kept gnawing upon it until 12 o'clock. When we went on deck, I felt somewhat like a man, and could begin to learn my sea duty with considerable spirit. At about 2 o'clock, we heard the loud cry of "Sail ho!" from aloft, and soon saw 2 sails to windward, going directly athwart or our hawse. This was the first time that I had seen a sail at sea. I thought then, and have always since, that no sight exceeds it in interest and few in beauty. They passed to leeward of us, and out hailing distance, but the captain could read the names on the sterns with the glass. They were the ship Helen Mare of New York and the rig Mermaid of Boston. They were both steering westward and were bound in for our dear native land. Thursday, August 21st. This day, the sun rose clear. We had a fine wind, and everything was bright and cheerful. I had now got my sea legs on, and was beginning to enter upon regular duties of a sea life. About 6 bells, that is 3 o'clock p.m., we saw a sail on our larboard bow. I was desirous, like every new sailor, to speak her. She came down to us, backed her main topsail, and the 2 vessels stood head on, bowing at each other like a couple of war horses reined in by their riders. It was the first vessel that I had seen near, and I was surprised to find how much she rolled and pitched in so quiet a sea. She plunged her head into the sea, and then her stern settling gradually down, her huge bows rose up showing the bright copper, and her stem and breast hooks dipping like old Neptune's locks with the brine. Her decks were filled with passengers who came up to the cry of "Sail ho!" and who, by their dress and features, appeared to be Swiss and French immigrants. She hailed us at first in French, but receiving no answer, she tried us in English. She was the ship La Carolina from Havre for New York. We desired her to report the brig Pilgrim from Boston, from the northwest coast of America, 5 days out. She then filed away and left us to plow on through our wastes of water. This day ended pleasantly. We had got into regular and comfortable weather, and into that routine of sea life which is only broken by a storm, a sail, or the sight of land. And there we end with our reading for today. Notice how he doesn't say anything about someday I'll become a captain, someday I'll save my money and be rich and open a store selling sea goods. There was little hope of rising above your station in life. Now, Richard Henry Dana had the advantage of being here as a means to gain his eyesight back. He had been studying probably in poor light, and the doctors didn't know what to do about his failing eyesight. So he signed on thinking he could regain his health at sea. And of course, once he finished his 2 years, he went back to Harvard and got his law degree. And he spent many years of his life helping various seamen and helping with the laws that made sea voyaging and working on ships more tolerable. Well, that's our reading for today. I hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you next week. Oh, I want to thank our people in the control room. It takes the 3 of us, Alex Silva-Satter and Bryce Parker. We 3 try to turn this out every week. We do the best we can. Bye-bye.